no, that's 2 weeks from now, a week and a half.
Okay, so 2 weeks from now, she's going to present her full thesis. At New College, you have to write a full thesis and present it to 3 PhDs.
Yes.
And
one of them's here.
And go through an oral examination. So good luck. I'm sure you're going to do great.
Thank you very much.
But anyway, I love that, aspiring alum. Done soon. So Rachel's work has focused on relief from natural disaster, relief through resiliency, relief by work within a community. And she's using both performance and archaeology to address these questions and to how communities recover and deal with disaster. So she is our winner of the student grant paper. And Rachel, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Before we get started, and thank you for introducing me, Sherry. That was really sweet. Before we get started, I just want to thank Time Sifters and thank everyone here for having me, and thank Time Sifters specifically for choosing me to be one of the recipients of the Cornelia Futur Memorial Grant. I'm really grateful for that, so thank you. Before we get started, I'm going to cover a few things because we're going to go on this roller coaster ride that I'm still figuring out myself, which is my entire compiled thesis project. So the thesis of my thesis is, can a particular performance practice, being ecotheatre, be an effective methodology for heritage interpretation in the time of climate change specifically? So I'll get into all the jargon later, just so we can be on the same page, but I want to preface my presentation by saying you're going to see pictures of the performance that I curated and directed on every slide, so you get an idea of what the performance was, because I unfortunately can't show you videos today. So, and if you're interested in those videos, you can come to me and give me your emails, and I can send them to you afterwards. It's about a 20-minute performance. The performances happened twice in a single day, one at low tide, one at high tide, and it consisted of 3 actors, each performing monologues or oral histories that were connected to hurricanes. The first monologue I wrote myself about Hurricane Irma and my experiences growing up in a flood-prone neighborhood in a low-income family. And so that's Eugenia. She performed that monologue. The second monologue is from a play called The Breach that I was given the rights to perform. It's about Hurricane Katrina. It's about a woman talking about her memories of a friend who was able to escape the flooding in the lower Ninth Ward after the levee breaching, whose friends were unable to escape from that. So it talks about those memories and then reaches into like a larger systemic understanding of how poorly the government handled the aftermath of Katrina, and how there is a larger systemic indication of environmental racism and injustice that still happens presently. And the third monologue is an actual oral history taken from a woman who lived through the Great Okeechobee Hurricane of 1928, and that hit the lower southeastern curve of Florida in West Palm Beach. And it talks about how she was able to survive the hurricane and the flooding by being saved by an alligator. And so, yeah, it's really incredible. So before we get started with the actual jargon and theory behind everything that I'm doing, I just want to go over the hurricanes really quickly. Irma is a hurricane that I chose to write about personally because it was one that, like, the first hurricane I've really lived intensely. And the most recent hurricane, and most of our memories for those of us who couldn't evacuate Florida or couldn't get to a safer place, or those of us in Florida who didn't have to experience Maria. And it passed just a couple days, the day after my birthday in September of this past year. It curved up to Florida and hit the bottom part of Florida as a Category 4 storm. It reached Sarasota as a Category 2, but still left substantial damage. I'm sure a lot of us still have that really fresh in our memories. Hurricane Katrina is the second monologue I was talking about. This is the woman who performed the monologue. Her name is Sophia. Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in Texas in August of 2005. It is infamous for its catastrophic damage, mostly from the flooding after the hurricane. It is in most memories of people as a result of the governmental ineptitude in the wake of Hurricane Katrina and the harsh policing of a largely poor Black population as a result of environmental injustice and racism. It wasn't, like I said, it wasn't necessarily the hurricane itself which did cause damage, but the levee breaching in the lower Ninth Ward that led to catastrophic flooding in New Orleans. And the final hurricane, as I was talking about, was the Great Hurricane of 1928, the Great Okeechobee Hurricane, as is also understood. It is the second deadliest hurricane to have passed in historic memory. The fatalities are largely ill-documented because most of the people who suffered from this hurricane were Black and poor and living in West Palm Beach. But the numbers go between 2,000 and 4,000 people. Most notably understood recently, since around 2008, history has been coming up, and it was the majority of people who passed who were white in this time were dignified with funerals and with burials, but the majority of people who were Black and African American who were passed were not dignified with that privilege and were largely buried en masse or burned en masse and without any attempt to contact their families. And recently, around 2008, there was an activist, a local activist in West Palm Beach named Robert Hazard, who made the initiative to make a memorial park on top of one of those mass graves in West Palm Beach. And if you want more information about that, if you want to visit it, you can definitely let me know, and I can give you an address. But that's what this hurricane is most infamously understood with. So moving into the interpretation part of my presentation and my theory, I'm ultimately looking at ecotheater as a methodology for interpretation, specifically heritage interpretation, and just a real quick crash course on what interpretation is sometimes you'll go to a museum and people will lead you through the museum and offer you information, often in the form of docents, volunteers, or actual hired interpreters. As far as I'm concerned with it right now, it's a form of public outreach where an authority is interpreting complicated scientific, historic, heritage information to a larger public to make it accessible and to make it relatable, especially on an emotional level. So it's remembered and considered and understood as the person leaves the interpretive encounter. Freeman Tilden, in interpreting our heritage, which is largely understood as I was told by the interpreting coach that I'm talking to right now, is the Bible of heritage interpretation. And here's a quote I'll read to you, which I think is very funny in juxtaposition to what I'm trying to accomplish. He states explicitly in his book, "I am sure that what I am saying will not be misconstrued to mean that the interpreter should be any sort of practicing artist, that he should read poems, give a dramatic performance, deliver an oration, become a tragic or comic thespian, or anything as horribly out of place as these, and nothing could be worse." So me seeing this and having my entire project be about performance as interpretation sent me a little on a reel, but I want to validate this concern first before moving on because it makes a lot of sense, especially when he was writing in 1957. Theater, there are a lot of anxieties around theater as interpretation and around performance as interpretation. Firstly, because it's largely, there's a concern about heritage and these lived personal experiences of people as being commodified, specifically with heritage tourism or with performance and selling tickets to profit off of the memories of these people who you're embodying who are not you. So that is a really valid concern and something I was thinking about throughout this whole process, all three of these. Additionally, theater largely is understood as escapist and more fantasy-like. It conventionally, it comes with a lot of contracts, like how we're doing right now. You're sitting, I'm talking, you're not talking, you're listening, and there's not a lot of personal one-to-one engagement with in a theatrical space. You're seeing a story, you are not living your life at the moment, you're living the life of this story and of this musical maybe, or of this nice play, because you're escaping, which is fine in a lot of cases. But when you're dealing with real life stories of people, it's important to understand that and perform it and interpret it with sensitivity and respect. Which leads to the question of care, which is what was at the forefront of my mind going into this production, is who are we, who are my actors, who am I to direct them to embody and dramatize the past? So that's a really big concern going into this, and I approached it in a way that I had each actor pre-record the monologues vocally, that I then had it played or like audibly while an audience was sitting on a beach watching this performance happen. So they weren't literally acting out the performance, they weren't literally acting out the memories, they were adjacently embodying them to put a person onto them, but not like claim them as themselves specifically. And so that was able to give people like a person to like see this emotion coming out of, but like understand at the same time, this person is not the person who I'm watching, but it's an emotional connection being made. And as we all know, also, that was the girl, the woman, the person, actor who embodied the third monologue, Okeechobee Hurricane. She had a gator in her arms to represent that she was a child at the time, and also a gator became like the thing that saved her from drowning. And it was a really lovely memory to be able to enact. Continuing with the idea of performance in interpretation, we all have seen, or at least heard about, museum theater and live theater actually happening in museums as well. We know about reenactments, we know about tour guides who often dress up as a person of the time period or of the site that they're a part of and interpreting for you and acting in that way. And it exists, and it's a thing that's been happening for a while. And so at this moment, the definition for interpretation and theater together is the application of theater and theater techniques for the interpretation of cultural heritage. It's very simple in that people identify theatrical tools and performative tools that can be applied to interpretation to make it more of a personalized, engaging, emotional experience for people to be able to engage that way. So often theater is a dialogical tool where someone will want to keep talking about it after they leave and have conversations about the content after they leave. And that's really important to interpretation, to keep the idea of what they just saw and the memories of what they just saw alive. It also materializes the immaterial for greater accessibility. So you can definitely like sit in a room and listen to an oral history and imagine it that way, but when it's materialized in front of you, it gives a much different effect that can often be effective in different ways than like sitting and listening, while that's still valid can be. And most of the scholarship of museum and theater interpretation was published within the last 20 years, while most of the anxieties about theater existed between the 50s and 80s, and theater as interpretation existed between the 50s and 80s. So performance in theater has changed a lot, and while there's still a lot to work on, a lot to understand as maybe problematic in terms of heritage interpretation, there are tools presently to be able to treat content respectfully. So here's what ecotheater is ultimately, and how I use it as a method of interpretation. Overall, ecotheater is the creation of mindful pieces that highlight struggles of environmental injustices, animal experiences, preservational and sustainable acts to ultimately create an ethical and ecological understanding of the natural world. Theater is usually a very human medium, but ecotheater centers the environment and the ecological problems alongside the centricity of the person, because theater is made by people, ultimately. So ecotheater relies on humans and more than human bodies as agents. For example, in my production, you can see all three of my actors in the line here, each of them interacting with these bodies of mud and water that ultimately that had their own agency entirely in this production, as the performance was reliant on the tides and how your body can move in the water and how your body can move in higher to lower water. So there was a huge agency in the water and the mud here, and those work together to make meaning through the course of the production. Usually, an eco-theater performance is site-specific, which is just a theater word that means your performance is structured around a specific place, and the specific place informs your performance. And ultimately, it considers and platforms environmental issues on human-centric narratives, which is something I feel like I've explained. So this all leads up to the case study that I curated and it's titled Wake, Living Within Disaster. It took place in late February. These are just the posters that I used to advertise them. I wanted to point out that these are just pictures of the actual aftermath of Irma. This is my mom sitting outside. I took a picture of her through my doorway. Our power was out like everyone else's was, and she just, it's an image of like exhaustion and just the effects of this hurricane on the mentality. And this is a picture of a hallway of a school building on my campus. We call it Bond House, Bond Senior House building, where Hurricane Irma ruined the sewage pipes in a way that there was sewage bursting into the building. So the entire building had to be totally made a skeleton and everything taken out in order for it to be rebuilt. And it still hasn't been able to rebuild for a lot of different reasons. And so there are a lot of professors who don't have offices right now, and this is a picture of the hallway that most of the offices shot off of. So this is where I was going to show you videos, but this is the first monologue that I wrote about Hurricane Irma and the person performing it. I'm sure all of you are thinking, why did you make this poor girl dig a hole in the sand? Ultimately, the monologue ended with her being concerned about that sea levels are rising, hurricanes are becoming more unnatural. What happens when memories start becoming drowned as sea levels rise? What happens when the water rises far enough to start erasing memory? And so she's saying this she's performing it alongside the monologue as she starts digging at the end of her monologue. And this references a lot of things that I'm not sure I have a lot of time to explain, but she's digging into the sand as a form of memory, digging memory. And this is at low tide, so she was able to dig really deep before water started coming up and covering the bottom so she couldn't see it. In the low tide performance, you don't have to dig very far to find water rising underneath. And so it became more of a struggle and a labor to keep getting to the mud underneath it to represent like a struggle to maintain memory and maintain like keeping memory alive as water rises. This is the second monologue. This is during a time of extreme frustration in the monologue where there's a line where she's talking about it was needless death. It was death caused by man. And then she stands up and she takes mud from the bottom of the water. It wasn't caused by nature, it was caused by man. And she's flinging this mud, which also remembers, kind of materializes memory in a way, and this frustration and this sorrow as she has this moment of anger at the system that has enabled the death of so many people. And this is a final shot from the third monologue where the girl is realizing there's an alligator holding her up after the hurricane has passed. There are moments in this monologue that pinpoints the racism that was going on at the time. It was during a time of segregation, obviously, in 1928. And there's a line in the monologue with the oral history, where the woman says, "Not even a storm could mix us in those days," as she walks into a protected building, and there are white people and black people separated, even in the wake of a storm. And so you can tell, like, even though she's having these memories as a child, it's still visceral and still in her memory, because when she was telling this story, she was like late into her 80s. And it just shows the persistence of the system that has enabled so much damage to Black communities and people of color and low-income families. So overall, I want to definitely enunciate I'm not saying that this should be the only way interpretation can happen with memories in the time of climate change. I just want to articulate that that ecotheater can augment tools that are already in place and at the choice of the director or at the interpreter or in any case. Theater is, as I said, capable of materializing intangible heritage and memory, which is a kind of heritage item I was working with was memory and communal memory at the same time. It opened dialogue around difficult topics and memories. I had so many conversations with people after the performances ended, talking about like, oh my God, I didn't realize this is what was happening in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. I didn't realize that there's this understanding and like there's a fortified understanding in the people who lived in the lower Ninth Ward that this breaching might have been purposeful in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, or before or right during. And they didn't realize the information, and so they were able to understand that. And they talked about how they were remembering their own things, their own memories of hurricanes, and how scared they were, and how they're just now realizing that these storms aren't really natural anymore. And I feel like that's a really valuable dialogic outcome of seeing a performance that interprets heritage materials like this. It also engaged communal memory and public imagination insofar as on-site at my performance, I made connections with Greg Cruz and Mutual Aid Disaster Relief to set up a donation box for people who felt so inclined to bring supplies or bring donations to this organization who was amongst the first people in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And we raised a little over a quarter of what they needed to go into their next relief effort, and I thought that was really, really valuable and really meaningful. And that's all for the performance part of my thesis. And I want to point out thank you to all my photographers, and these are my beautiful actors, and I'm grateful for all of them very much. Thank you. Any questions? Because there are probably a lot. Yes.
This is fantastic.
Thank you.
One thought I had was how scripted were your actors? I know you said you wrote the script, but how much did you decide what they would do when they're in the settings that they were in?
That's a really good question. I wrote only the first monologue. The others weren't adapted or cut by me in any way. And in their pre-recording, they wouldn't have to worry about memorizing it and maybe getting something wrong in the interpretation of the oral histories. Secondly, they weren't acting it out as if they were living it. It was more of like moving their bodies through the water as these memories are washing over them. So I choreographed some parts of each monologue, but ultimately it was the actors feeling the presence of this memory in the moment and navigating their own bodies in the water in the moment, because they had to adapt themselves in both performances. If that answers your question.
Well, and they did it a number of times, I would imagine.
Yeah, they did it twice in one day, but that was it.
So did it change?
Oh, dramatically. Yeah, the memories themselves weren't changed at all. The words weren't changed, but their bodies adapted to like the higher water. The high tide was particularly high that night. It was more of a labor walking through the water, which is something I was definitely considering because the actor who did my monologue, she was the only white person in my cast, and she didn't have to, based on the blocking I gave her, go through as much labor. She got to choose to go into the water and come back. So that's something that the other actors were placed in certain ways that they experienced more water navigation. And of course they were okay with that and they were excited to participate. But at the same time, it meant that water was rising higher on these memories and these stories much more than the monologue that I wrote. Yeah, very different. Yeah.
When were these pictures taken?
These pictures were taken the day of the performance. It was on February 28th, I think. They were taken by four separate photographers. One of them was my brother. One of them was Greg Cruz from Mutual Aid Disaster Relief. He's an incredible photographer. He's a very talented man. And one of them, some of them were taken by Tristan Johns, who's a friend of mine. Another one was taken by Brie Nieves, who's a friend of mine. This one was particularly taken by my friend Brie Nieves. So they were all taken on the same day, but by different people. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah.
How many people are in the audience?
It varied. There were many more people present for this, the second performance at low tide. Because it was in the evening, it was around 6 o'clock, and so the sun was setting. So it was an experience of a community coming out to see this thing at the sunset, and seeing sunset is like, I know it's a communal thing throughout Florida, but specifically at my school, New College, it's a thing people do daily. The first performance that Uzi saw, most seats were filled. We didn't have enough seats the second time.
Wow.
And there were about 30.
I would say about 40 in that.
40 chairs. I mean, yeah, true. I had to carry them put in the places. But yeah, 30 to 40 chairs, and they were mostly filled. Thank you, everybody.